Ilana, it becomes not just Mike and Ilana, but maybe there's more of these kind of town halls, because I think that's what you have built here. You've built for us a town hall. So Ilana, let me pass this over to you to begin the program.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you to you and the Wilson Center, and also the team at Arctic Frontiers, Julia and Anu and Naima, for their support in developing this event. I'm going to quickly introduce who we have, and then we'll get right to the case. We're lucky to have a great team and panel to kick off this discussion. Over here we have Gunbritt Retter, who's head of the Arctic and Environmental Unit of the Sami Council, and has been part of so many Arctic governance settings over time. We have here in the middle Evan Bloom, who's a senior fellow at the Polar Institute of the Wilson Center. And next to him, we have a representative of the Emerging Leaders Program joining us they just came in almost just hours ago, or an hour ago, from their study tour. His name is Zdenek Dvorak. And finally, over here, we have a colleague from University of Tromsø, the Kari Miklebust, is Barron's Chair in Russian Studies. And finally, joining us in the digital space, we have Timo Koivurova. Everyone can say, I don't know if you can see all of us, we can wave. He is joining us from Japan, has stayed up very late to participate, and he is research professor at the Arctic Center at the University of Lapland. He won't be on the screen all the time, but he will be here and listening, so a bit like Santa Claus or something like that. We won't see him all the time, but he's paying attention. And finally, myself, Alana Wilson-Rove, I'm a research professor at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, where I head our Center for Ocean Governance. And we're excited to just kick off the program.
Thank you, Ilana. Last year we had Gunbritt looking down on us. And so maybe that's another tradition. We have somebody even from somewhere. So here's the idea. The idea is we've asked our colleagues to do the following. Introduce 3 key interconnected areas that have undergone some change in 2022, and that's just to get the discussion going. So think about what they share with us. And then we've also asked them to give us 1 key action that they would like to see realized in the policy field. We'll go through that in order. Gunbritt, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to go first. Once we've gone through those, I'm going to turn to all of you in the audience and try to elicit your thoughts on those perspectives, your own perspectives, and some insights as well. Gunbritt, please.
Yes, thank you, and it's great not to be the elephant in the room this time. 27 years of Arctic cooperation between Arctic states and Arctic indigenous peoples organizations, or through the Arctic Council, or 32 years when including the Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy, or the Rovaniemi Initiative from the 1991. This makes the Arctic Council a unique international forum where indigenous, as I said, indigenous and Arctic states sit together. Over these years, the Arctic indigenous peoples have demonstrated that we can work collaboratively in consultation and cooperation with others with the aim to safeguard our homelands. And we have demonstrated that we are trustworthy partners in decision-making and policy-making. And we attend to the rules of the game most of the time. Now this cooperation is on pause, and the Sami Council fully sees the needs for this step to be taken. But I cannot, however, hide that this geopolitical situation has put the unique feature of the indigenous people's involvement in the decision-making at a test. Well, with cooperation on hold, there is no decision-making in the Arctic Council, but it is apparent that some agreements have been made. So even though the Arctic Council is on hold, the Arctic cooperation among states is not a complete cooperation without the full, effective and meaningful participation of the Arctic indigenous peoples. And maybe it is exactly during these tough times that the Arctic indigenous peoples organizations and representatives, most of which are cross-border organizations, have something valuable to add. Having that understanding of being a people living on each side of the borders, I think adds some value of thinking of borders and conflicts. In questions on the governance in the Arctic, we must remember that the Arctic is our traditional homeland and territory. So as indigenous peoples, we have and will continue to exercise our right to self-determination and self-governance to our lands. So when it comes to environmental protection and sustainable development, we need strong partnerships to protect these lands and waters for future generations. Primarily, I'm concerned of the continuous war and all the humans that suffer on both sides. On behalf of the nature, or Mother Earth, I'm concerned that continuous war and the waste of resources and what I expect increased demand for resources required to keep this war going. During war, there is likely to be less opportunities to monitor the impacts on nature and environment. And the rapid need for resource exploitation on the Russian side and what it means for the indigenous peoples' territories, the environment, and the climate change at large. So I don't know if that matched the 3 points that you asked me to raise. But I'm also very concerned that this situation will last long. And I guess the question is how to take care of this situation today and tomorrow, and also that the question that was, and how about 10 years from now? Well, maybe I have some other points. I can leave that for later. Yeah.
Thank you. Evan, let me impose upon you perhaps to go next. And I know we asked you to maybe focus a little bit about oceans governance as well and scientific cooperation. Please.
Mike, thank you very much. Elena, Gunn-Britt, thank you very much for having me again here. It's wonderful to be back in Tromsø. I spent a long time at the U.S. State Department in Washington working on supervising polar issues, but also oceans and fisheries, and so I think that's what you wanted me to focus on for a few minutes here. So I'll look quickly at some of the current governance issues related to oceans, fisheries, and science cooperation. And of course, governance has a lot of different aspects. Some of it is international because most of it is domestic, but that's not really what we're focused on here. So from my point of view, Arctic governance since the Ukraine invasion has been a study in contrast. The Ukraine conflict has had a major impact on Arctic governance and has raised serious security concerns for a lot of governments. Now, the Arctic Council, as we were discussing in one of the panels this morning, the Arctic Council has been significantly affected. But other bodies are more or less doing okay. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. In part, this shows the greater resilience of treaty-based bodies. Of course, the Arctic Council is not an international organization, is not treaty-based. But it also shows how cooperation can be easier if it's focused on particular regulatory needs rather than something more amorphous in a way like sustainable development and environmental protection, which is the core of the work of the Arctic Council. So to be truthful about it, the Russians have been willing to work with others and to more or less compartmentalize the Ukraine conflict. But others, and I think rather properly so, are not so willing, given the rather outrageous behavior of the Russian government. But bilateral cooperation not involving Russia has always been a large part of cooperation in the Arctic, and that sort of cooperation continues. So in terms of oceans governance as a whole, of course, oceans governance is really important for the Arctic. And with respect to large multilateral organizations related to the oceans, they have continued to do their work. So the International Maritime Organization, the International Seabed Authority, they tend to continue to meet their large multilaterals. The Russians come as they have in the past. With respect to fisheries, bilateral contacts in many cases have continued. Norway and Russia is a particular example. And the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, which I'm sure many of you know about, had their first conference of the parties in Seoul in November of this year, and with a Russian delegation present. With respect to, for example, extended continental shelf, the work going on in the context of the UN and the Commission for the Limits of the Continental Shelf, trying to figure out the entitlements within the within the Arctic Ocean, there had been meetings of the A5 littoral states, but those stopped after the invasion, and there haven't really been, at least for the U.S., on the U.S. side, official contacts with Russia on that issue. But the Commission for the Limits of the Continental Shelf has continued its work. But overall, you have to consider that there has been a degradation in the quality of cooperation and effectiveness, even in these various bodies. Now, with respect to science cooperation, there's been a breakdown in many cases in science cooperation involving Russia. Non-Russian scientists are not going to Russia. There's difficulty in exchanging data sets. As you know, the Arctic Council science bodies, working groups are not doing their normal work. So this has created a long-term setback for science given the importance of Russia to the region. Now, also the Scientific Cooperation Agreement, a treaty that was negotiated under the auspices of the Arctic Council, it also is not functioning well at this point. But there remains good cooperation among the Arctic states other than Russia, and you would expect that to continue. So anyway, I'll stop there, but if I'm supposed to say an area that where one could improve, I would say that there are opportunities within these treaty-based organizations to reach out to the Russians at least in some context to improve either fisheries management or other oceans topics. But I'll stop there.
Thank you. We talk about the future of the Arctic. You can't do that without having the future of the Arctic with us. And so we want to give you some time to give us your perspectives on any of the areas that have already been spoken about, areas that you think we should focus on, or areas that, frankly, you don't hear us talking about and you really wish you would.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I would like to start with that I'm representing a group of 33 young professionals and emerging leaders from all over the Arctic, and they are sitting here. And of course, that in the time of the war and energy crisis, nature crisis, and climate crisis, there are many issues which we are concerned about, and I would like to give you some of our perspectives on that. First of all, climate change and biodiversity loss in the Arctic. This is an issue which, of course, goes down on the agenda. And we also see that there are more and more natural disasters which are crossing all the borders, both between the nations and indigenous people. And in order to address those environmental concerns, we have to do it through cooperation. And research sharing and scientific exploration are more important now than ever. We also think that the hyper-focus on reduction of climate or climate gas emissions is very crucial, but at the same time, it kind of fails to solve economical, social, and environmental problems which are connected to the climate change. And we would like to see maybe an approach where you have where you work with a sustainable development which is equitable, and that you have kind of more holistic approach to it, and then we also strengthen the cross-sectorial cooperation on the shared Arctic issues. The second point concerns actually the elephant or the bear in the room. And of course that as a consequence of the invasion, we are losing a lot of scientific and research collaboration. And there is also this huge risk that this war will actually set also the green shift or the green actions back by several years. And at the same time, we as a young people would like to look to the future where the war ends one day, hopefully. And then we have to find a way, on the other, how to cooperate and coexist with and trade with Russian people. So were actually some questions. There are some questions we want to raise. The first is like, how can we ensure people-to-people cooperation and cross-border connections in a time of a war? And the second one goes on, what can we do now to prepare for this transition to peace? And the third point, which we think is very important, is concerns Arctic communities and people, because the situation we are in set back the community cooperation across the Arctic, and we would like to see more action on strengthening the resilience of Arctic communities and support the sustainable development. For instance, to see programs which enhance exchange, project cooperation, development of best practice for all the Arctic people and particularly indigenous peoples. And as you of course all know, what happens outside of the Arctic has a significant effect on the Arctic. And also that the Arctic communities historically has been contributing least to the climate change, but actually are bearing the consequences the most. And this is also a point why we mean that the decisions about the Arctic should be made by the people living in the Arctic in a bigger scale. And we also have some kind of specific key policy recommendations when we are like talking about what can we do forward. The first one is connected to research. We mean that we should highlight, support, and consolidate existing portals of Arctic research, data sharing, and lines of communication. And we would like to see open data access in order to solve the climate change and biodiversity loss in the Arctic. Second one is that we would like to have more focus on the development of Arctic communities and regions. For instance, we would like to see a funding program for community and regional development between North America, Greenland, and European Arctic. And last but not least, we also suggest that the Arctic Council, when it starts working in a way or another, facilitate youth involvement in decision-making and equitable process to this. So to wrap it up, we would like to call on the Arctic states to increase accessibility to research, to connect Arctic communities and regions, and to empower the youth in the Arctic.
Thank you very much. Great list. Kari, you spend a lot of your time looking at the Norwegian-Russian bilateral relations and societal political changes in relevance in relation to Russia. We're going to really look forward to your comments here, particularly on Norwegian-Russian relationships, since we're here in Tromsø. Please.
Thank you, and let me start by saying that I'm very honored to be here and to be part of this distinguished panel discussing what I think are highly topical issues, very severe issues. I will start with revealing my conclusion. My main input is that in today's situation, I think we need to work to develop new strategies to secure sound and reliable knowledge building on Russia, because we are cut off from cooperation with Russia, but still we need knowledge building on Russia, which is free of war propaganda. So, and Russia is a state that is deteriorating rapidly, which I think is obvious to everybody who follow Russian news. Of course, the warfare in Ukraine is devastating, first of all, for Ukraine, but it is also for Russia and for Russian civil society. So I'll start with this. We see this in the militarization of Russian society, of schools, universities, workplaces, and we see how Russian society is cracking up. We see it in the isolationist policy of Russian authorities towards its own population. We see it in the sharpening of the laws on foreign agents and laws on undesirable organizations, not least environmental NGOs and NGOs for indigenous people, which have been under hard pressure in Russia over the last decade. We see it in the total state control of the media sector. And we see it in all the domestic Russian efforts to close off Russian society from contact with Western partners. And these are not new developments, of course. We have seen them over the last decade, but they have accelerated rapidly due to the warfare in Ukraine. One example from my own field of work, which is history and social science, approximately 1.5 years ago, so prior to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russian authorities implemented new legislation on international research cooperation. So agreements with higher education, foreign partners for Russian research institutions must now be approved by the Ministry of Research and Higher Education in Moscow. So this means that federal Russian authorities are controlling the research and education sector in Russia, and there is no room left for cooperation with Western partners except with the permission of the authorities. Of course, this new legislation has not been tested. We've had the corona pandemic, we had the full-scale invasion, which put a very definite end to institutional cooperation. So it remains to see how Russian authorities will apply this new jurisdiction on international scientific cooperation, but it's there, and it's a very clear sign of this isolationist policy, I think. And then, of course, the warfare is accompanied in Russia by heavy war propaganda, and it's very hard. I find it very hard as a Russian, a researcher on Russian history and also Russian contemporary history, sitting on the outside to evaluate how Russia is actually developing, what is actually happening. Also, what we have witnessed over the last year is higher willingness with the Kremlin to take risks, both in foreign policy but also in domestic policy. So they're pressuring their own population through forced mobilization, first and foremost. We see in the mobilization policy, but also in the general policy, controlling civil society by harsher and harsher legislation. And here is my main point. This all makes it more important than ever to follow and analyze the developments in Russia closely, because things are getting worse and more unpredictable rapidly. And the importance of following developments closely is true, not least for Norway, which is a small state and a NATO member bordering directly with Russia, both at land and sea. I will not go deeply into Norwegian-Russian cooperation in the Arctic. I think the audience knows that this has been deep and very important both for Norway and Russia in the whole post-Soviet period and also during the Cold War. And now we are in a situation where decades of developing bilaterally cooperative governance and also cooperation bilaterally in a number of fields is replaced with suspension of almost all cooperation, with the exception of fisheries management and research. And this summer, sadly, Norway also closed its northernmost general consulate in Russia, in Murmansk, in the borderland to Norway. And only a few weeks back, Finland did the same, closing its consulate general in Murmansk. And this is due to, I think, first and foremost, security issues, as seen from Oslo and Helsinki. So this all leaves us with one big challenge. We no longer have interaction. We no longer can continue cross-border cooperation. Also on a people-to-people level, I think it's highly problematic, if not to say impossible, because Russian jurisdiction will put Russian partners at risk if they engage in cooperation with us. And the policies of the current Russian regime makes it impossible to imagine that we can resume cooperation in the foreseeable future. And still, the paradox is that we need more than ever to monitor Russian developments. So this is my main issue. How can we secure sound and reliable knowledge on Russia in times at war, of war? I do not know if you want me to. I have a conclusion. Should I save it for later?
I think you should do it right now.
Okay. Without access to field work in Russia, without access to research stays in Russia, without collaboration with expertise in Russia, because there is a lot of expertise who want to cooperate with us, but cannot do that in the current situation. I think what we can do is support the building of Russian exile expertise, pro-democratic exile expertise, integrate and cooperate with Russian exile academics, experts, journalists, the diaspora, and make sure that their competencies are put to use and support them in their new lives here with us. As the repressive policies towards civil society and in particular political opposition in Russia has forced many bright minds into exile. We are in the lucky position of having them here among us, and I'm sort of sad on behalf of Norway to say that I see how American research institutions, Canadian research institutions are much faster than Norway on including integrating Russian exile experts. I think Norway has still a way to go in this field. So I think that Russian researchers in exile, Russian experts in exile is a resource that we must cherish, invest in, and support, both for our own sake and for the sake of Russia. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So we just talked about cross-border relations or lack thereof. So Timo, I'm going to bring you back on the screen. Is that correct? Okay, Timo, you're live, so we can see every move you're making, my friend. Even that one. Okay. Yeah, we appreciate it. Timo, thank you for doing this for us. You have a lot of friends here in the audience staring up at you, so the pressure's on. But let me turn the virtual floor over to you. And we've asked you, to be fair, we've asked you maybe to speak a little bit about the Arctic Council, but also about the border relationship between Finland and Russia as well. And again, thank you very, very much for spending some very long hours with us.
Okay, thanks very much, and indeed honor to be part of this. So I will first say a few words about the bilateral cooperation, and then about the Arctic Council cooperation. And I'm doing this on the basis of a report that we did to our government, just released also in English language, Arctic Cooperation in a New Situation, analysis on the impacts of the Russian war of aggression, that can also be found from the internet. So first, as in Norway, and I'm a little bit thinking differently than the previous speaker, I think that Norway's bilateral relations with Russia, as far as we were able to detect, are quite well functioning already with Russia. Border cooperation, search and rescue, fisheries, but also like in Svalbard, Russians' rights have been respected as part of the Svalbard Treaty. In Finland, the same is going on. So we have, for instance, a general agreement on managing our border waters with Russia, signed already in the 1960s and is still in force. In 2020, the two parties were supposed to celebrate the 60th anniversary of this cooperation, but due to Russia's war in Ukraine, it was decided that no celebration would be held. Yet the annual meeting was organized as an online meeting in October 2020, but only the very basic issues were discussed at this meeting. Yet cooperation between the parties, technical and hydrological information exchange is all the time continuing. Another relevant related treaty arrangement is between Finland, Russia, and Norway to ensure the kind of sustainable utilization of this Patsjoki River, High North Patsjoki River by Russian Federation. They have a dam there and the energy station, energy power station. And the three parties have continued technical cooperation with each other also after the Ukraine invasion and plan now an online meeting for the spring of 2033. Very complicated situation as regards the Arctic Council. So we know that the Western Arctic states, 7 of them condemned Russian illegal attack on Ukraine, temporarily paused participation in all meetings of the Council, and subsidiary body is a forum that is currently chaired by Russia. Yet they also stated that these measures are taken pending consideration of the necessary modalities that can allow those 7 states to continue the Council's important work in view of the current circumstances. And with the June 2020 statement, they resumed most of those projects where Russians are not involved. But the signaling, at least so far, from the 7 Western Arctic states has underlined the importance of the Arctic Council work. Currently, we are waiting how the chairmanship can be transferred from Russia to Norway, and how can Russia continue as a member of the Arctic Council if the war will continue, and yeah, that will be a difficult issue. Mike, do you want me to say a couple of final words, or shall I stop there?
Why don't you say a couple of final words, Timo, and then we'll move to Ilana.
Yeah, perhaps something that when we did this report, I think that obviously in Finland, we are facing a kind of nightmarish scenario from the viewpoint of our defense. But at the same time, for instance, when we did the report to our government and we interviewed a huge load of national and international civil servants, I think that it was fair to say that people were already looking into the future and looking into resetting the cooperation one way or the other, because we are losing a lot of important values by not cooperating in the Arctic. And we are not doing much when we are not doing cooperation in the Arctic. We are not affecting any change of Putin regime.
Thank you very much, Timo.
Thanks.
Okay, we saw that too. Thanks. Ilana, please.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. I will be brief because I'm excited to hear what those of us who are joining here in the room have to say. I tasked myself with security and geopolitics, not exactly my favorite theme of governance, but I kind of just to round off the bigger picture, that of course also things have been changing in the broader security backdrop. We've heard about it at different junctures today. I think a lot of it relates to also what Kari was covering in her presentation, that there's had to be kind of a rethinking in general of security politics and risks, with a much obviously more risk-taking Kremlin, and some of the logics and rationalities that especially in an Arctic security setting that we've imagined formed a sort of familiar rational basis of, say, interest in economic growth. We've seen that in other vectors, that Russia's willing to sacrifice that at the great expense of Ukraine. So also another big change, of course, is Finland and Sweden's planned accession to Norway, which changes the security architecture. I think from the Nordic side, it's seen as a great clarification and creating a lot of opportunity for an effective defensive posture, in also as it relates to the European High North. I've heard sometimes mentioned, will it change things eventually when the Arctic Council gets going, that 7 of the 8 Arctic countries are NATO members? But I think in some ways it's, given how security issues have been largely defined out, kind of in the longer term perspective where we might imagine this is going to resume, I think it will probably simply bring some clarity of alliance dimensions into the picture, whereas I can't really see how it would hamper a classic Arctic Council cooperative issue. In the security sphere, one of the things that's changed is that, of course, often I mean, the Arctic Council, for example, had, of course, many cooperative outputs that were very specific and important for different policy fields. But also in a more general sense, it was seen, at least, you know, in some others, in Norway and in other states, as part of the kind of assurance side of the relationship, that there was clear security rivalry, but there was also cooperation, and the sort of balance in the relationship was important. And with the cessation of these relations, which I think was, you know, an appropriate response, it does put the burden, or the kind of all of the signals relating to security or relating to overall foreign policy signaling are more in the military or security sphere. So that's an important, makes military signaling of even higher importance. I think there have been, don't want to talk about this too long, but also, you know, there's some discussion of, like, does it change in the sense that, you know, the Arctic Council also functioned as kind of a signal of order. This is how the relationships of governance are to be structured in the region in a broader sense. And there is some concern that, you know, will, for example, Russia really deepen their relationship with China in a way that is maybe of countervailing interest to the other Arctic states. And I think that kind of leads me to some of the recommendations and thoughts. I think it's good to see the discussion, sort of some of the points Evan was bringing out about kind of the other range of governance settings that maybe still function or have some opportunity. I think there's enormous scope also for, you know, continued expansion of bilateral agendas between Arctic states that are cooperating well, and hopefully inclusive consideration of how can any different modalities of cooperation that could pursue an important Arctic governance agenda in a time when the Arctic Council as a typical kind of focus of attention is not functioning as it was, how these modalities can be inclusive of rights holders and Indigenous peoples organizations in the region that have been so important in the Arctic Council's development itself. I think in one last point, I think there are some kind of important, but maybe a bit kind of boring sounding projects that would be really good. I think it would be important to follow up. WWF used to have this report card looking at implementation of recommendations. I think there's something to be said in kind of taking stock saying we have all these great knowledge-based recommendations when the Arctic Council was working as it could and should at those times. And in all global governance, the implementation gap, as it's called, is always huge. But there's a chance to really focus on closing that, I think, in this period. And then secondly, in speaking to Kari's points also about competence, is that I think there's a risk in this period of, you know, in the main plenary we were talking about, what was it, the kind of the price crisis. You know, that life is getting more expensive, national economies are struggling, and then there's a risk to maybe kind of cut that research budget, to cut kind of the support to this or that agency that had a big active role in, for example, carrying out Arctic Council work and cannot do it at this moment. And I think instead we really need to be thinking about how to fully finance and build competence in all aspects of the Arctic governance network, and in some cases building it in ways that allows, for example, other maybe non-state actors to have a more independent and financially independent role. I have recently, Timo's listening, that I recommended Timo's report to someone the other day, so I'll take a small moment for a rather awkward product placement relating to these recommendations. That the Wilson Center NUPI in 2 weeks will be launching at the Munich Security Conference a new report for the Arctic Security Roundtable, and we'll be able to share that publicly. And we invite you to, there are flyers around, you can sign up, and it'll be emailed to you as soon as it goes public. You can also find my colleague Maria, who can take your email address. But we'd really like to share that, not because simply in the spirit of getting the report as far as it can, but also just in continuation of today's sorts of discussion of having brought together some knowledgeable people who care about and want to see a more stable, governed, and peaceful Arctic, and came up with, I think, some useful recommendations and perspectives. So thank you.
Thank you. It's okay to have product placement. That's okay. It's a good thing. Okay, I have a lot of things I want to say, but I'm not going to say them because now it's your turn. We've got, I don't know, not enough time, maybe 15 minutes or so, 20 minutes or so, to entertain maybe some brief comments or reactions from what you've heard from our colleagues, maybe a very short question. But this is now your time to either speak to us on the stage or better yet, to each other, about any of the issues you've heard here, or if you'd like to bring up another one. And let me encourage our youth participation here to do just that. This is a great time for your voice to be heard, to be listened to, and to help direct us. Please, sir. Do we have a microphone? We do have a microphone. Excellent. Right here, all the way down that way. Perfect. And tell us who you are, please, and what your bank account number is.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I don't have much. I'm a PhD student, so. Well, my name is Larry, and PhD student at UIT, and also emerging leader. Most often when discussions about, the aftermath of Russian invasion in Ukraine, some of the things that's missing, I think, is collaboration across borders between young people. And as someone who had had opportunity to be a participant in some of these collaborations and also organized one when I was with Arctic Frontiers, I felt that probably we are missing the point of the reason why we started some of these collaborations. And one of the reasons why I think we started this is international peace education, so we could change stereotypical mindset of young people between living in the Arctic, so that in future, if they assumed positions, they could understand themselves better. I have seen that the Norwegian Barents Secretariat, for example, had kind of made amendments to its sponsorship of programs by now agreeing to support collaboration with young people that are organized by private institutions, right? So I'm just curious to find out from Carrie, does she think that a continuous collaboration with young people pose security problems for them? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for a very relevant question. And I very much agree with you that in the current situation, it's hard to keep in mind all the good intentions that lay at the bottom of Arctic cooperation in general, the Barents cooperation in particular, and this whole aspect of trying to bring Russia into a rule-based order to integrate with Russia in a constructive way that was at the base of these cooperative structures is sort of erased today. And I would like to emphasize that this is all on the Kremlin's what do you say in English? Well, the isolationist policy that I talked about from Russian authorities make this kind of cooperation highly risky for Russians today, yes. And I know that the Barents Secretariat have tried to adjust by inviting individual artists, young people who do not represent a Russian institution into cooperation, and they have managed so far. But I think that the risk involved is very high for these Russians, and we do not know what they are facing at home. So this is why I've come to the conclusion that I presented here, that the part of the Russian expert field that is available to us is the ones in exile, and we should first and foremost nurture cooperation with them, I think. Yes, thank you.
Another point or question? Please, ma'am. We have a microphone coming. And I know we only have 10 minutes left. Right? No?
7.
Wait until 7? Well, then.
It's
Then I'm
7
gonna-
a.m. actually.
And then
7 a.m.
Yeah.
7.
so-
Can't see him on the stage. No.
I think since there's so much time, I'll read from my dictionary. But first, 2 quick questions and point to say for the Arctic future people, just don't let up, keep expanding, keep growing, keep doing what you're doing. 2 questions. One, I guess, is for Evan and Elena and Timo, I'm not sure. But in the context where there is a power, Putin's Russia, that engages in an invasion unprovoked and follows up with war crimes and toward genocide, how does one decide how far you go in terms of engagement? And I'm not talking person to person, because I tend to...
What's the limit?
The limit, and what are the elements to take a determination? One. Second is on Indigenous with respect to Gunnar Britt. You said some very interesting things, I thought, in the context of, okay, so we're in this terrible situation. It's not likely to go away anytime soon. And to look at, for example, the Arctic Council in the sense of the role that Indigenous peoples are granted in the context of the hierarchy of the Arctic Council. And if one is using terms like food sovereignty or domestic dependent nations, or I thought what you were saying was, how do we engage in such a manner that we increase our capacity to act as sovereigns across the high north? If that's the case, what does that look like? And final point is NATO. So Article 5, certainly, but to me, I would be interested in your thoughts in terms of the sort of some conversations about NATO moving north. So someday there won't be Putin and there won't be KGB. And so it would be whether Russia's a one country or it breaks up into 10, to establish a situation. The question is it wise to establish a situation where there would be a NATO presence? Thank you.
Mike, the gentleman in the red tie behind her has a...
Okay, we'll take that one next. Ambassador, you have something you'd like to? Do you have a question? Why don't we do this? Why don't we answer this one?
That's what I was thinking of. That's perfect.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Okay. Anyhow, we have time up to 7 o'clock. Okay.
Apparently we have till 9:30 now.
Okay, one point and one question, actually. When I visited here, I'm Korean Foreign Ambassador, and when I visited and meeting my counterpart of Arctic state, I know that now the security concerns come first. And so question to the panelists that Norwegian scientist here is that I'm really curious about your domestic politics and your public opinion on this matter, because the Arctic region changes great many risks, even except these geopolitical ones, such as climate change. And so what's your domestic public opinion on this matter? There are some people that, even though facing this kind of geopolitical risks and challenges, certain kind of cooperation must go on regardless of this geopolitical risks. That's because it's just some question only insiders can make, and so I want some kind of comment from your side. And another thing is a point from the outsiders. I'm Koreans here, and our environment in the Arctic region is basically related to the facing and fighting climate crisis. And if you give me some time, I'll give some examples. Last summer, Korean a camera team to make documentary film visited Svalbard Island. And the camera captured very unbelievable things. Mosquitoes in Svalbard Island. And this lunch, I had a chance to the Korean scientists who stationed in Svalbard Island. And she told me that this change is real. The summer in Svalbard Island, the temperature rising much faster than even public imagination. And so nowadays, young generation in Korea have paying more and more attention to this climate crisis, because this young generation who are going to suffer the consequences. So from the outsiders, Korea is ready to make contribution to fight climate change crisis in Arctic region. We are going to continue our cooperation with each Arctic members bilaterally, such as Norway and Finland and Sweden. So on that part, our contribution will go on. But as an outsider, what's going on in this region is, in terms of geopolitics, it's kind of a real mystery and also a great challenge as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we can tie a few of these together. Who would like to? First of all, Ambassador, thank you for providing that perspective perspective and asking questions of those living in the North, because you do not, but it's very good for us to hear why Korea is interested in the North and what capacities and equities you have, what equities you have in the North, what capacities you have to bring to the challenges of the North. I think it's very important for non-Arctic states that have interests and concerns in the North to bring those forward so we understand them better, because as you know, people want to know, they want the answer to that question, which is why your country would care about the North. It's also nice to hear the questions that you ask, because that gives us more insight into the concerns that you may have or the interests that you may have. So let me just back up a little bit. Anita, you asked a nested number of questions, so let me try to pull one of those out. Then Ambassador will pull one of yours out and try to respond to them, and then move on to some others. So the first one, which was interesting, which is sort of like, what's that red line, right? When does it normally age? At what level? What are the characteristics? What are the conditions? And maybe we can get some insight from that. Who might want to take a crack at that? One at a time. Okay, Evan, thank you.
Thanks, Mike. I guess there are a lot of different ways to tackle this question, but part of it, at least what comes to mind for me, is spending a lot of time at the United Nations and in multilateral organizations. And I think you'll appreciate that there are a lot of difficult countries in the world. They're not all nice and wonderful, and the reason you conduct foreign policy with other countries is to try to influence and gain information about all sorts of different types of people and countries, and so you don't have the luxury of only trying to cooperate with the ones you kind of like, or democracies, etc. But it seems to me that what we have in a situation with Russia is worse than most cases. I wouldn't want to say, well, this is, how to compare it with other types of genocides, or what nuclear threats from North Korea, all these sort of things. It's very hard to parse all of those things out. But I think what the Russians have done is shock the conscience of humanity. And you get to a certain point where there are all sorts of things where you can imagine that it would be in your own interest to work with them. I mean, the climate change issue comes to mind very quickly. We have to all be working on the climate change issue in order to resolve these things. So simply we're not going to deal with Russia at all, that's it, becomes something where you're kind of hurting yourself. So, but I will say that I was very strongly in favor of what the A7 did in terms of the Arctic Council, because I think that even though the Ukraine crisis occurred outside of the context of the Arctic and outside of the Arctic Council, it was a necessary follow-on. And what allied countries are doing, not just Western countries, but others as well, and reacting in multilateral organizations is an appropriate response. There will be exceptions. You mentioned fisheries issues. There are Coast Guard cooperation, safety of life at sea, these sort of things, which may fall into a different. So not really answering your question, but I think the Russians have gone too far, and therefore very broad reactions are necessary.
Thank you, Evan. I know Timo would like to respond as well. Timo, please.
Thanks very much. I think that one kind of important angle to this kind of how do we evaluate what can be done after what is happening in Ukraine, and of course this is most horrific things that we can imagine. In international law, the basic idea is that yes, the countries can support Ukraine in various means, supplying military assets, training even Ukrainian troops, provide sanctions against Russia. So those are really the key issue, and they are responding to what Russia has done. In international law, the other idea is that this should not affect Russia's treaty relations in other fields that are not that it hasn't reached all its treaty commitments by attacking Ukraine. So the idea behind here is that certain order will be maintained. And I think it's important to emphasize this because we will be facing new geopolitical tensions, wars, etc. in different parts of the world. So we don't necessarily have to see that, okay, this is now on, and there will be nothing more. Or we know from the history that these geopolitical tensions will arise in different parts of the world. And then I think that we need also the kind of advice from kind of the international law, public order of the international society. I think that that's also one way to look at this this horrific situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Timo. Please.
I would like to comment a little bit on this as well. I think it's important to say that despite the situation, which is horrible, we are still neighbors with Russia from both sides of the Arctic. And we have, for instance, bilateral cooperation between Norway and Russia on the fisheries. And maybe it's up to the national governments to draw the red line. But we've been discussing it a lot that at least in science cooperation, which is so important to also mitigate the climate change and so on, there should be some opening to actually do that. And it's also the people-to-people cooperation, which is important in that regard. And another thing is that, we have kind of been discussing those consequences for a while, since it's almost 11 months now. And I think that it's also for the people living in the Arctic important to actually focus on maybe what kind of opportunity it gives to the rest of the Arctic. Like, for instance, the Scandinavia have had a lot of cooperation with Russia before. This is not possible now, but maybe it kind of gives us a chance to enhance the cooperation with the North America, which we didn't have that much on, especially on the community or the regional level. And I think it's also important for us as a young people to kind of, the big picture maybe doesn't look that best, but to kind of have some positive plan on what can we do now better without Russia, and also kind of to have some plan B how to get them into it when the situation allows.
Firm up the foundation, enhance the partnerships, sort of doubling down on a lot of the things that we're already doing. Gunbritt, was there something you wanted to respond to? I feel like I'm
Not at this stage, but I think she raised the hand.
I decided to wait.
You decided to
I
wait?
did.
Okay. Well, I see a hand in the back. Then maybe I want to come back to the question the ambassador raised a moment ago as well. Kari, if you would take that afterwards. Okay, great. Let's do this question first, or the statement first. Please. And again, tell us your name and your bank account number.
All right, perfect. This is Abby Tingstad from RAND. Thank you, first of all, for holding this event once again. It's really helpful, and I would love to see this continue in the future. My question, and maybe we need to go back to the other questions first, and this will be a follow-on, but my question is looking back at something that was discussed during the big picture session today, which is the issue of dueling narratives and misinformation, misunderstandings about the Arctic and where we are right now when it comes to the dialogue about and information about cooperation. So on the one hand, we have been talking about needing to not do formal cooperation with Russia in the Arctic, and for very important good reasons. On the other, you've also given a number of examples of how cooperation is still occurring, which is also something that seems to be useful to advertise and to talk about. So where is the line there? And I mean that from a managing the narrative both at maybe a global perspective, but also with Sami communities and Russia, maintaining that communication. How much are we cooperating? When are we not cooperating? And how do we ensure that the information that needs to belong in the public sphere gets out there without it being misinterpreted? Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to respond to Abby's note? Please.
Yeah, I can at least respond to some of that. And sorry for all my coughing. I didn't calculate the heat of the lights and the wool and the excitement of being on a panel, which makes the throat itchy.
Mostly the excitement.
Yes. Yeah, I really liked Kari's, the whole intervention she made first, because I think she very well portrayed the challenges that we as a people across borders, as Sami people across borders are facing. And that's exactly the individual security. So we have Sami Council is a pan-Arctic, a pan-Sami organization with member organizations both in Russia, Norway, Finland and Sweden. And at the moment we have had to put our membership organizations on the Russian side on hold, and there are several reasons to that. And in the individual security or the security of individuals is one of them, because we are not sure how they will be received, how their engagement with us will be received on the Russian side. But the other is also the economic forces that were put on us, that if we have any kind of in the beginning, that has been loosened up now, and I might have said that last year, that those who are funding the work of Sami Council put restrictions on if we have any cooperation with anybody on the Russian side, our funding will be cut. And that's a terrible situation to be put in as an indigenous people. That, in a way, you have to choose. So, sorry about that. I've been among people for a long time, so yeah. So that is definitely something that we try to keep the informal engagement with people where we can, because I think it's important to do that in a way to be ready when this war gets cold. So to put it that way. One of my earlier points was that the Arctic Council was created in the aftermath of the Cold War. And I think what we are in, the situation we are in now is to balance, it's a balancing act on what level of cooperation we can keep going to be ready to build trust when the war gets cold. But I also had the question from there. I don't know if I take it now, why my throat is not itching, or if I... Yeah, there was a question of what sovereign indigenous or something, I said, I guess it was related to, I mentioned self-determination and self-governance and how that would look like. I can only speak from the Sami perspective, and our approach is that first of all, I received many invitations to cooperation to become to be a stakeholder, and we always respond that Sami people are not stakeholders in the Arctic. Everybody else, except from other people who live here, are stakeholders. This is our homelands, and from the Sami perspective, we seek to be part of the decision making through the existing system, which is a national state, like at least for the Nordic countries, Norway, Finland, Sweden. And we have to develop, we have consultations agreements with the governments, but we have to ensure that that the Sami people are part of decision making of decisions that have impacts on them at all levels.
Thank you. Milana, I'll go to you in a second here, but this is why I always appreciate when you say yes to being a part of these discussions. Because these discussions that we're having here, they impact us all, and those of us who live in the North, this is where we live. We have our families here. This is not a political exercise, although it's politics. It's not a policy format, although it's policy, because these decisions impact all of us that actually live here. So it's real to all of us. But you bring a perspective that makes that sort of two-dimensional narrative that I just gave. I live in the North, I do. But you are from the North. You're of the North. And we throw that line around a lot. But there's a difference between your experience in the North and my experience in the North. And so for you to share that with us, it makes 2D become 3D. It makes it far more real that we're not just talking about an exercise, a discussion at a conference. We're talking about us, our lives, and the difference in our lives and how it impacts all of us. So thank you for always saying yes to making yourself vulnerable, literally vulnerable to us, so that we can actually understand the implications and the impacts of decisions that are made or not made, and what the narratives are. They're not just words. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Love.
Well, I just wanted to follow on the point also that I think that it's incredibly important also the long-term considerations, the question of how long does cooperation remain paused, what are the long-term consequences, but I kind of feel a sense of frustration over it. It seems like now I can give you a little amateur therapy. This is going to be free. But when there are large situations outside of your control, there's often a focus on what can be controlled, what can be changed, what can be done, kind of picking up on your parenting advice from earlier today. And I think that there's a lot of missed opportunities, as noted in what you said, Gunn-Britt, at the end about kind of the complexities of your funding situation. I mean, that obviously seems like something that as the situation stretches out in time, it's not temporary, that needs to be revisited about how to create kind of independent, flexible funding arrangements that allow for transparency, but also some greater trust and independence in such important organizations for the Arctic. And secondly, I guess I just wanted to know, my other sense of frustration is, of course, like the climate crisis is, the cooperation with Russia in the Arctic Council or elsewhere has produced some useful information and some perspectives, but there's an enormous amount of unused agency within Arctic states, community, different levels of Arctic governance that could be harnessed towards addressing the climate crisis and building on, again, I'm kind of a bit of a broken record on this, but building on some of the recommendations of the Arctic Council's work in the past. So perhaps a shift to the actions that are possible and already recommended.
What is the deal? Question on this side? Oh, in the back. Sorry, far right back. There's a microphone coming. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Arthur Mason. I'm an American researcher working in Norway. I was just sort of struck by not only this conversation, but throughout all these conversations, sort of the illogical and irrational behavior of Russia. I mean, how we sort of constitute that that state as just sort of acting in it's impossible to understand. And at the same time, we're also talking constantly about sustainable transitions, energy transitions, climate change. And I'm wondering, is there any connection between that? I mean, is this Ukraine invasion? I mean, is this what peak oil demand looks like? I mean, are we just in, this is what sustainability transition looks like, endless war? I mean, is it, why is this one country constituted in such an illogical manner and disconnected from these other conversations that we continually say are so important to us?
That's a heavy statement there. Great. Seriously, it's a great. Kari, I'm sorry. I have to ask you maybe inform us a little bit more. Give us some more insight.
I'm not sure I can, but thank you. It's a sort of philosophical question, I guess. Russia is part of Europe or not part of Europe in terms of history and culture and political culture. And this is the big thing that we cannot figure out today, of course, the rationality of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, because it's devastating to Russia. It's devastating to Russian economy, it's devastating to Russian politics, Russian environment, Russian indigenous peoples, every field. And there is, as I've seen, I've been looking for answers for the last year, and there is no good answer as to why this very irrational decision by the Kremlin, unstrategic, devastating decision to invade Ukraine. I don't know, but I was at the Alexandria conference at the University of Helsinki last autumn, and we discussed actually Arctic cooperation, and I noticed that the representatives from the Baltic states, from Canada and America agreed that under the pressure of war, Russian state administration, the Russian state apparatus has become more opportunistic than ever. So it's a fight of everyone against everyone. It's a very dark analysis, of course, but I think that's some of the answer, that the dire situation that Russia is in now sort of gets out the worst in everybody, and perhaps also in Arctic issues. I am no expert on Russian Arctic governance, so I would pass on the question to everybody else in this panel. But I think that this opportunistic attitude also in Arctic politics has been present from the Russian side for some time. And the invasion has put this very much in the middle of what we are all wondering, how sincere are statements, or have statements coming from the Russian side on Arctic cooperation been over the last years? How sincere is the will to cooperate on environmental issues, on indigenous issues? And I will also once more take the opportunity to emphasize that Russian authorities, as I see it, when I watch Russian news, they are not only waging war in Ukraine, they are waging war against their own population. And this is perhaps the biggest catastrophe when it comes to what we have seen in Norway, a long tradition of people-to-people cooperation in the Barents region, and all these layers of a cooperative framework that has been so important for civil society on both sides of the border, that the Russian population today is and has not been for a while politically free to cooperate with us. Yes, thank you.
Did anyone else, excuse me, did anybody else want to follow up on that? If not, I'm either going to go to the audience, or I'm going to raise a point my own self.
Mike?
Yes.
Maybe just a short one. I'm personally from Czechoslovakia, so from one of the countries which was part of the Soviet Empire for a while. And I think it's important to kind of look back up in the history. And this is a very big difference between the Western Europe and Eastern Europe in that regard. And there was, from my personal point of view, never democracy in Russia, actually. So this is also important to have in the thoughts that there is a huge difference in the history and the culture and in the viewing, the reality. So even though it might seem to us irrational, it has some rational, which is difficult to understand, but
And just to supplement briefly, and I think it's more the question of, I think in a lot of our analyses, we laid in a kind of a national self-interest, and economic growth as having been an important, perhaps countervailing balance against a rationality that has to do more with geopolitical competition, expansion, and also kind of, long-standing narratives or narratives that didn't accept, for example, Ukrainian sovereignty or Ukraine's right to exist as a state. And so it's not that that's necessarily rational, but I would say I think we probably, in some of my thinking on the Arctic from like a decade ago, probably focused more on the capacity of interdependence and of economic interest, and that Russia's well served by international law, and some of these focuses probably gave them too much weight. So I think it's more of how do we weight, knowing that parts of the state apparatus are kind of at great odds, but at the same time that decision making ends up being much more centralized in so few persons than I think some of our more hopeful analyses would have suggested.
Thank you. Anyone else have a question or a perspective? If not, then maybe put out a point or two, maybe get reactions from all of you. Only if they're good reactions. No others? Okay. Earlier yesterday, I was on a panel. Now we have about 10 minutes left, right? And now at 5, wow, they cut it to 6 minutes. Okay, I'm so confused. The argument, the question I was asked was, what is the condition of the Arctic? What's the condition of it? And there's so many ways to answer that, environmentally, economically, socially, politically, culturally. But what is, give us a scan, Mike, of that. And for some reason, I went to someplace very different. My response was visceral. My response was the state of the Arctic is strong. Now that seems counterintuitive to everything that we've talked about and everything we have seen in the last 10 months or so. But my reaction of the Arctic, the condition of the Arctic is strong, doesn't reflect the fact that we have an environmental crisis. I know because we're all living it. We have a geopolitical crisis. We have a security crisis. We have a number of crises we're dealing with. So why would you say it's strong? And I guess I went to the Pollyanna side of my life, which was, look at what's happened here. A ground war in Europe that's reverberated around the globe. It's impacted all of us. Children, babies, husbands, wives, you can keep going, have lost their lives, have been murdered. I mean, these are stark words and stark photographs. If you were to take your television and do a walk back in time, when you can actually adjust the color on your set, for those of you my vintage, you know, and if you made that color go away and it was just black and white on your television, and if I said to you, this is a film clip of World War II, you might actually believe it. It's that stark, at least through my eyes. So it's through that lens that I answered strong, because we're here. We've come to Tromsø. We're talking about the Arctic. The Arctic 7 are working. As Evan said, there is the IMO. There are other organizations that have buttressed up over the years the work that were done and haven't been enduring for the last year or so. And so although the fabric's been frayed, there is absolutely no doubt, and we will change, there's absolutely no doubt, decades of friendships, decades of institutional partnerships, decades of bilateral and multilateral relationships, decades of building the Arctic Council, on, I think has allowed us to endure this storm. The storm's not over yet, right? The sails are kind of ripped and we're trying to navigate this. So my sense of it being strong is that it has endured. And we've come out, not the other end of the storm, but we've kind of seen a path forward. The path forward is to double down on the cooperation, our international relations, having a circumpolar north more cooperative than not, inviting other like-minded countries to the table to help us address the challenges. That's why I say the state of the Arctic is strong. Maybe what I mean is the state of the Arctic people are strong, or the state of those who care about the North is strong. So I don't know if there's much time for reaction, maybe a minute or two, but please argue against me, because I actually believe that. Again, not Pollyanna, but I actually believe that it's been strong, stronger than perhaps I would have thought of 10 months ago. Oh, that's crickets. You can't leave me.
World War II?
Does anybody buy that argument? Is there something? Nobody buys that argument.
I think they've just wowed. They're
Is that what
quiet,
that is?
yeah.
Okay.
If I can blither for 1 second, I'm sorry to follow up on a second thing, but Churchill seemed to said they come, what was his quote during World War II? They're coming in the skies, they're coming across the beaches, et cetera. I agree with you 100%. The values of the West, the processes of communication that have evolved post-World War II, it is all there. The structures, the infrastructure is there. It's being cracked in half, or cracked. The question then is just what you're saying is how does it get, how does it stay on course and build and strengthen? And coming out of it won't be going back to what it was. I don't know what it'll be, but it'll be something else. And with every reason to believe, and what you just said is in fact the case. And on the environment issue, there is resilience processes that are going on. Folks up in St. Lawrence Island in the Bering Sea have said, we've been doing this for 10,000 years. So, you know, human capacity to adapt. I guess, forgive me, but I 100% agree.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Please. One last, we have time for one last one.
Well, I'll try not to ask too complicated a question because I'm sure we're down to 2 minutes. But Liz Perrin, I'm an emerging leader from Canada. Yeah, I think just asking the panel, you know, I think about how in this time of conflict, like the economic needs for collaboration have kind of superseded a lot of like open research and other types of collaboration, you know, across Indigenous peoples who don't have aren't bound by country borders. I'm wondering if there's folks on the panel, if you were to imagine this war has already continued much further than I think any of us could have anticipated, specific policy actions that would help foster some collaboration to ensure that, you know, as we emerge from times of conflict, countries that are more set up will be able to have access to the green shift, and then whereas folks who are experiencing that kind of war-torn situation won't be able to access the kind of green shift initiatives in the same way. So I'm wondering if there's, you know, anyone on the panel specific policy actions that you would say if we're sitting here a year from now, still in the same kind of gridlock situation. I'd love to hear what you see as a bit of a what you would recommend. Thank you.
Okay, one response, and then I think our time is done. Anybody want to take that? One policy action. I think we've reached the limit.
Did you have the answer?
Timo should take that one.
Timo. Timo, yes.
I have this theory about a strong Arctic. Timo may not have answers. Maybe this is one of those follow-ups because I think
We'll still be here,
Okay.
you know, in the next couple decades.
we'll be back.
We'll look forward to it.
We'll be back again next year. Timo, thank you, my friend, for doing this in so many time zones away. It's appreciated. Would you please thank this wonderful panel and thank yourselves for a really good discussion. I think we have a tradition now. Next year, who knows? Thank you all.